Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a frontline update for the 26th of November 2022. Before I get on to the frontline update or the frontlines itself, there's quite a bit of important preamble to discuss with you, notably some very interesting points on the Institute for the Study of War report from yesterday that I want to discuss. But let's just quickly go through a few of my normal points, which is always to try and start with the numbers that Ukraine released for the Russian losses from the day before. There is a significant uptick in terms of liquidated personnel. I'm not quite sure what that represents or why that is, but 560 personnel, and then we've got 2 tanks, 4 APCs, 1 artillery system, 1 UAV, and 2 other vehicles. But it's the figures. It's at least 130, I think, or troops lost. So yeah, things are not looking good. There's a lot of talk about conditions across Ukraine in terms of particularly the mobilized troops and their uniform, the weather, and that there'll be a lot of people dying from things like hypothermia, frostbite, and so on and so forth. So lots of different sources are talking about this. I want to refer you back to the Ministry of Defence. So yesterday, I talked about how the UK MOD released a statement saying that it was likely that Russia were targeting medical establishments and hospitals. And I was saying that likely is a very deliberate word, and it's one of the sort of modals that represents a probability, and it has a definite probability assigned to it. I said, because I was doing it off memory, somewhere between 70 to 75%. Actually, it's 55 to 75%. So it's quite a large range for likely. But still, they've got good reason to think they had at the time of making that statement, good reason to think that Russia were probably targeting hospitals on purpose. Well, actually, the next day, Russia have said the UK MOD have said Russia is using Iranian drones to strike the electrical grid and likely targeting medical facilities, and then added this statement, which is to quote the ambassador Kariuki, the UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN. Now, in order for them to quote this, they endorsed this, and this is agreed. They agree. The MOD agree with this statement, and in fact are probably providing the intelligence behind this statement. So the quote is, Russia is deliberately bombing hospitals and other medical facilities. So it's now gone from likely to deliberately. The World Health Organization has recorded 703 such attacks since February. Russia is trying to achieve with terror and murder what it could not achieve in 9 months on the battlefield. But this is a really important statement that the UK MOD is saying, and indeed the representative to the UN, because there's now seems to be little doubt that they are definitely purposefully attacking hospitals, that hospitals are an objective. And to stay on the UK MOD, it's worth talking about today's statement they brought out, which is Russia is likely removing the nuclear warheads, again, likely 55 to 75%, removing the nuclear warheads from aging nuclear cruise missiles and firing the unarmed munitions at Ukraine. So an open source imagery shows wreckage of an apparently shot down AS-15 Kent air-launched cruise missile, ALCM, designed in the 1980s exclusively as a nuclear delivery system. The warhead had probably been substituted for ballast. Although such an inert system will still produce some damage through the missile's kinetic energy and any unspent fuel, it is unlikely to achieve reliable effects against intended targets. Russia almost certainly hopes such missiles will function as decoys and divert Ukrainian air defenses. Whatever Russia's intent, the improvisation highlights the level of depletion in Russia's stock of long-range missiles, something I keep talking about. And I keep questioning myself over, because they do send these waves, but the waves are punctuated waves. In other words, there is a wave of missiles, cruise missiles, that Russia send in a saturation attack, but then they wait a week. So, for example, last night, particularly another quiet night in terms of drones and cruise missiles. The question is, why are they not sending them on consecutive days? Now, some people are saying in my threads even that, it's because they're waiting for things to get fixed up and then hitting them again. But actually, you could really debilitate the energy infrastructure if you did 2 consecutive waves, saturation waves. You just absolutely hammer Ukraine, and they'd be in all sorts of trouble, but they don't. And it seems that they require some time to get the stocks in. That there is some talk about, some of these systems are aging, or the missiles are aging, etc., etc., etc. And so it just takes them a week to get stuff together again to send another wave, and then they're kind of might be working out whether they should or can be using these stocks as they go further into their inventory. And if they're using, deactivated nuclear missiles, then what does this say? So it really does look like they are running low on stocks, even though they will continue to send waves, no doubt. Okay, a few other points to make, and this is a hugely important stat. So when you look at things like this, so this is your shelling locations reported by the Ukrainian General Staff. The Russians continue to indiscriminately shell both civilian and military targets. It's very heavy down in Kherson, like the actual city of Kherson, but as you can see, up and down the fronts, and really heavy across the borders into Kharkiv, and I hear as well Sumy today or overnight has been shelled. So that's further along the border as well. So Russians are obviously shelling. That's not the heaviest I've seen it though. So I don't know what that tells you. But talking about Ukrainian artillery capability, a third of the roughly 350 Western-made howitzers donated to Ukraine are out of action at any given time. Pentagon's European Command has set up a repair facility in Poland. So there's been this, there's one of many sources talking about this, and actually referring to a New York Times article. But there's a lot of talk about just quite how many pieces of kit are in need of serious maintenance, and that's because they are getting absolutely hammered in terms of being used day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out. And those barrels, the rifling on the barrels ends up going, or they burst, or they just need general maintenance for a whole host of reasons. Panzerhaubitze 2000s, they are possibly the best SPG, self-propelled gun in the world. However, they basically weren't designed and made to withstand the usage that Ukraine is putting them through, and so they are in constant need of maintenance, and a number of them are out of action, and there are 6 being fixed in Lithuania. I think they've agreed to fix 12 of them. And so that is a continued challenge for the Ukrainians. Okay, let's go to the Institute for the Study of War. Sorry, there is quite a lot of preamble, but not a lot of movement on the front line. So, there you go. There's just some really interesting stuff that the ISW are talking about in their own preamble towards their frontline analysis. Reports of poorly staffed, provisioned and supplied Russian mobilized personnel are dividing the Russian information space, exposing the tension between military blogger mobilization narratives, Wagner Group narratives, and actual Russian efforts to alleviate morale issues. So mobilized personnel from Supukov, that I showed you this video yesterday, Moscow Oblast, claimed on November the 23rd that the Russian military command sent them into battle without proper training, uniforms and protective gear, leading them to suffer mass casualties. These personnel also claim that command only feeds the mobilized personnel once a day, despite having enough food to provide more meals. A Russian source reported that the Supukov mobilized personnel now face a military tribunal for desertion, but the men later released a second video denying that they are deserters and stating they are willing to serve in the second and third lines of defense rather than the front line, which is fair enough. You've not given us any training or enough equipment, and you're sending us onto the front line. Come on. So what this has done is provoked a really varied response in the Russian military blogger sphere, which is a super important nationalistic sphere that is influencing decision making in the Kremlin, and they're trying to keep them on side, while at the same time getting frustrated with some of the criticisms that come from these people who want more to be done, who want the Russian forces to be even harsher than they already are. So the ISW says Russian military blogger response is split between calling for compassion for the mobilized personnel and punishment only for leadership and punishment for the entire unit. And it goes on to detail how you get that range of response. Some people really are feeling sorry for these mobilized troops and saying not enough is being done by the Kremlin. Others are saying these guys should be done for desertion. and looking at the harshest punishments for these guys. It's like, well, yeah, but what would you do if you were in that situation, Mr. Blogger, sitting back in your pants in some flat in the middle of St. Petersburg or whatever? Do you know what I mean? So, and then other people just calling for the management, if you like, the leadership to be punished and held to account, and even Wagner, some sort of Wagner sources condemning this aspects of this in different areas of of command, right the way down to the people at the bottom. So this is, as such, these mixed responses, from these military bloggers, uh, give the Kremlin something of a headache, with various Kremlin and external affiliations about ongoing mobilization issues further illustrate the extent of the erosion of Russian morale and the increase in confusion among the pro-war nationalist community resulting from poorly executed mobilization and other forced generation of efforts. Fascinating. Okay, you might have seen that Putin met with a bunch of women yesterday who are supposedly women, family members of people who had died, mobilized troops. So there's been a lot of pressure from these mobilized troop families for Putin to meet with them. Well, he did meet with them, but it seems like they were hand-picked women who were actually people from quite influential political positions themselves, and it was all just a PR stunt. And he sort of assuaged them with different sort of bits of propaganda, really, saying, "Oh, you should actually see some of the speech is really interesting," saying, death is inevitable, and 30,000 people die from drunk driving or whatever on the roads every year, and blah blah blah. So I don't know that it's actually assuaged the real mothers who are still, um, you know, really upset about missing children. And so that's interesting where how ISW are detailing that. And then we've got they talk about the financial woes that the Russian federal budget is representing. They talk about that, but I won't go into that too much. But I do suggest that you read all of this. It is really interesting. And the POW exchanges, Russia are apparently getting quite a lot of internal pressure to get some of their POWs back, and so now they're starting to organise more and more POW exchanges. There's also this idea of trying to open a pipeline down near Kherson and trying to get Ukraine to, or Ukraine might agree to open this pipeline back to Russia if they can get a bunch of their own POWs back. So there's all sorts of sort of things going on at the moment behind sort of closed doors in terms of swapping POWs and whatnot. And also a lot of talk about these Iranians. So a Ukrainian official has confirmed that Ukrainian forces killed Iranian advisors in Russian-occupied Crimea in October, and stressed that Ukraine would target any Iranian military presence on Ukrainian territory. Let's talk about special forces taking out Iranians as well. Um, and I don't know whether some of that is potentially happened on the Kimberley Peninsula too. Uh, Danilov has not specified how many Iranian advisors Ukrainian forces killed, but in October the 10th, Jerusalem Post report put the figure at 10 Iranian military advisors. So that's interesting that they appear to be, purposefully targeting these drone trainers who are Iranians fighting in at the end of the day in what they see as their country. And there's also some documentation that's being apparently spread around Russian by Russian leadership, talking about the need to mobilize 5 million troops or people in order to fight what they see as the war with NATO in Ukraine. It's not seen as a war in Ukraine, war with Ukraine, but a war in Ukraine with NATO. And so this might be a precursor to seeing a whole lot more than 300,000 troops mobilize, but up to, X million. Okay, sorry, that's a really long preamble, but I think it's important to get those pieces of information out in order to understand what's going on the front lines. Let's go to the front lines now. Okay, let's start with the northeast as per usual, which is let's have a look at the war mapper map up here. The Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna line, Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna. First thing to say is that there is some evidence that Russia are trying to push back around here, the Kupiansk, trying to take back some lost territory around Kupiansk, but they've been repelled basically everywhere. There's a lot of fighting around Kuzmivka again and Stenemakivka, just to the northwest of Svatova. Very important establishment here, and then the town just to, or settlement here, the town just to the west of that, which is Novoselivska, is also the scene of a lot of fighting. So, as no report says, Russia unsuccessfully counterattacked in Novoselivska. Yesterday, we confirmed Ukraine controlled it. For some reason, Russia tried to retake it today. Heavy fighting near Kuzmivka, and early reports suggest a Ukrainian breakthrough near Maiorsk. Probably pronounced that very, very poorly, but let's find that on the map. So the news could be coming out about this settlement I've had pretty much contested, at least the edges of it contested. So there could be some news on that concerning a breakthrough. Defmon says in the Svatova area, the Ukrainians repulsed attacks in the area of Stenemakivka, as I said, and Dobrova. Now, I'm going to talk about Dobrova a little bit in a second. Wargonzo had previously reported Ukrainian advances in the forest south of Kreminna. The statement today by Ukraine seems to indicate continued Ukrainian presence in the area of Dobrova, Kreminna. Which is to say, there's not a lot going on anywhere sort of south of Svatova. So that's not to say things aren't happening, but there's just no news other than probably same things happening. So artillery duels and positional warfare going on until we get down to Kreminna. And then there's this little sort of town of Dobrova that I have put back in Ukrainian control. And I did that based on a bunch of information that came out just say about a week ago, probably now, just under a week, to say that actually that had been liberated and the Ukrainians are pushing back in this whole forest here towards Kreminna and across towards Lysychansk and Rubuzhne and what have you. There are conflicting things coming out today. So, or yesterday, really, because I report in the morning from what happened the day before in Ukraine, morning UK time. So he's saying, repulse attacks in Dobrova. So Wargonzo has previously reported Ukrainian advance in the forest south of Kreminna. The statement today says that there's Ukrainian presence in the area of Dobrova, Kreminna. But then no report says some accounts, and sort of in scare quotes here, claim that Dobrova near Kreminna is liberated. Nonsense. Ukraine doesn't control it. Russia does. These claims are completely unfounded and even cast doubt on whoever is spreading this. Well, I've been spreading that. So this is an interesting attack of people who might be spreading misinformation. But then you look at other sources. Dobrova west of Kreminna is likely liberated. The battles continue. Ukrainian forces repelled assaults in the area for 2 days in a row. So in order to repel assaults from Russia, you need to be there and kind of in control of that area. That's how you repel. You can't be repelling them if you're not there, if you don't control it. And War Monitor, who's quite a prominent sort of source, says Dobrova west of Kreminna is likely liberated. The battles continue. Ukrainian forces repelled assaults in the area for 2 days in a row. So there's conflicting reports, and I wouldn't like to bet my mortgage on it, but it does seem like Ukraine certainly have some kind of presence in Dobrova. There's a video, I would love to show you bits of this video, but I don't have time, so I'll do it for my extra, of special forces, and I'll try and geolocate it really exactly, but special forces working in the Dobrova area here and sort of attacking a house with Russians in it, and loads of really interesting drone footage of special forces working. You've got both drone footage and body cam footage from the soldiers on the ground, and this is Dobrova. I will try and geolocate that exactly, so yeah, I'm not sure that I would agree with Noel reports here saying that Ukraine definitely doesn't control Dobrova, because actually most other sources seem to indicate that they do, at least in some way. But I'll try and get some clarity on that going forward. Actually, just before I go on, it's worth saying that the ISW also say that Ukrainian General Staff has noted the Russian troops attempted to attack toward Dobrova, 5 kilometers southwest of Kreminna. Russian sources continue to claim that Ukrainian forces are conducting strikes on Russian rear areas behind the Svatove-Kreminna line between November the 24th and the 5th. Okay, so yeah, that's Dubrova. Now, really, going all the way down to Bakhmut, but that's not to say things aren't happening around here. There's heavy fighting all the way down to Bakhmut and past Soledar and Bakhmutsky. A few bits and pieces to say about Bakhmut. As far as Bakhmut is concerned, not a lot of change on the front lines, particularly the usual stuff going on. Ukrainian General Staff reports continued offensives in the Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians repulse attacks in the area of Bilorivka, Yakovlivka, Bakhmut, and Opitny. So nothing unusual. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this is the area that we have seen most of the video drone footage of people, of Russian soldiers dying or really suffering with conditions, with hypothermia and the cold and not having the right uniform, equipment, and nourishment. So that is interesting. That may feed into other things. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the kind of command that Wagner supposedly has. So people like War in Ukraine, who's a YouTube channel I watch every day, he's quite damning of both the Ukrainian and Russian armies as being Soviet-style, top-down hierarchical, very non-dynamic command structures. But Wagner, he says, have the advantage because they can kind of do what they want, and that means that they're really dynamic, and that's why they're more effective on the battlefield. So he says, and I think he's going to do a presentation on that. However, there is some information to suggest that's not quite the case, and it might be a little bit more complex than that. This is what Andrew Perpetua says. Well worth sort of reading this. Wagner commands their soldiers from the top down very strictly. They're told what to do on a moment-to-moment basis. Lay down, fan out, move up to that tree, fire on this location, etc. They're controlled by drones who fly above them. It's kind of like a real-time strategy game. If you don't follow the command you're given, they kill you. The commands are very simple because they don't trust you. You can only withdraw if you are commanded to do so. I mean, you've got to remember they've got a lot of recruits. They've got a lot of people who possibly aren't as well trained as well, coming from the prisons and whatnot. The HQ has feeds from many different drones and can see what is going on in many places at once. And they order all of the groups to move and behave. The purpose is to probe for weaknesses and then put as many resources at that weak point as possible, as quickly as possible. This is why casualties are irrelevant. The people doing the fighting have basically zero value. They do what they are told or they die and get replaced. I guess if you're working as a mercenary unit and you may be paid on the amount of territory you gain, and you're having to pay your soldiers directly, it doesn't really matter if they die. I don't think they'll be paying out their families in the same way a national army might. It's just, okay, they've died, right, let's get some more in, let's pay them, and we get paid on the amount of territory we gain. So like pile them into this weak points, and if they die, we'll just pile some more in. This is how Wagner turns people with absolutely no military training, experience, skill, or ability into an offensive threat. It's why I say the drone is their primary weapon. Wagner will continue as long as they have three things. One, cannon fodder. Two, drones. Three, ammo. So that's really interesting. That goes against this kind of like they're really dynamic and can do what they like. It's actually they have to do exactly what they want, but it's maybe that the commanders are really dynamic. So they're not beholden to, Soviet military doctrine, that they can kind of have the freedom to do what they like. And from there downwards, they're commanding their soldiers to do exactly what they want. And they don't have any kind of dynamic reactive capability below that level. And they are just being forced to do things like little units on a computer game's war computer game screen, where you as a player are getting to place them where you like, and it doesn't matter. You don't really feel anything for them because they're just little sprites on a computer screen. Well, it's kind of that feeling here I get from what Andrew Perpetua is saying. Interesting analysis. Let's have a look at what the ISW has to say about Bakhmut. So according to the ISW, Russian forces continue to focus their main efforts on conducting offensive operations in Donetsk Oblast. The Brigadier General Hromov stated on November 24th that Russian forces are concentrating efforts in the Seversk, Bakhmut and Avdivka areas with the aim of encircling Bakhmut. Gromov stated that 290 combat clashes took place in the Donbass over the past week, with 90 combat clashes in the Bakhmut area. He said the most difficult situation is in the Bakhmut area. And Russian forces have also attempted multiple times in the past week to break through Ukrainian defenses in Novelsky, down in Avdivka. Okay, so it's all happening around Bakhmut, the usual places: Bilorivka, Yakovlivka, Bakhmutsky, up to the north, and Soledar up there. And then you've got Opitny and Klishchivka, and places down to the south of Bakhmut, which, here it's all happening still around here and up there. So the ISW continue, because I think this is pretty important stuff that they talk about here. Let's see. There is positional fighting near Bakhmut. Russian forces established control in new positions in the southeastern outskirts of the city, so that'll be by the waste disposal center. Russian sources also reported that they have conducted an assault within 13 kilometers southwest of Bakhmut towards Kurdyumivka on the 24th and 25th of November. A Russian military military blogger, claimed on November the 25th that Russian forces fired on Ukrainian reinforcements moving to Bakhmut from the northeast through Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So that's interesting. So, the Ukrainians are getting reinforcements into Bakhmut. They understand it's a serious area, that is being hotly contested. Okay, so this is where it gets a bit funky. Influential Russian figures may be trying to set information conditions for the continued slow progress of Russian offensive operations in the Bakhmut area. Wagner Group financier Prigozhin stated on November 25th that he forbids Wagner fighters from giving interviews on the situation in the Bakhmut area, and that wishful thinking in Russian media confuses Russian service members and negatively impacts operations in the area. Prigozhin also stated that the task of Wagner Group formations in the area is not to take Bakhmut, but instead to degrade Ukrainian forces and their combat potential. This is hugely interesting. So he's now saying very publicly, we're not trying to take areas of Bakhmut. We're actually just trying to degrade them, the Ukrainian capabilities and capacity in the area. So this is kind of like having his cake and eating it. Of course, he'd love to take Bakhmut, and he is still trying to do that. But in the way of selling this to the public, he's saying, no, we're not trying to do that. This is all about just degrading the opposition. Prigozhin's recent comments stand in contrast to ISW's previous assessment that Wagner Group forces exaggerate territorial gains around Bakhmut and their responsibility for said gains to further distinguish themselves from proxy and conventional Russian forces. ISW. So on the one hand, the Wagner forces are like, yeah, we're much better than the Russian LPR, DPR, and contract soldiers and what have you. Because look at us, we're making loads of gains. We're the only ones that are making gains. And on the other hand, they're saying actually we're not really making gains because we're trying to degrade the enemy rather than actually take gains. ISW have also previously noted that the Wagner Group have not made significant gains around Bakhmut since June. Prigozhin may be setting informational conditions to shield himself and Wagner Group from criticism, and the results of their months-long offensive to take Bakhmut are incongruent with the continued claims of their success and operational importance in the area. And there you go. That pretty much says it all. I thought there's a really interesting analysis from the ISW there that shows the kind of different messaging that's going on around Bakhmut and what is basically not happening there, as well as what is happening there to a degree. There is huge amounts of effort from the Wagner PMC to pressure the Ukrainians in this area, and it is just a massive meat grinder. So let's move on to Maiorsk, which is just to, oops, what have I done there? I hate it when I do that. It's my fingers. Maiorsk is this sort of railway settlement, if you like, just to the south of Bakhmut, that has seen Russians advance there. Now, the ISW are saying that the Russians are completing a sweep of Maiorsk. I don't know what that means, and whether that means that they have kicked the Ukrainians out of the settlement just to the north of the railway junction and station itself, and whether that sweep means that they are sweeping this whole area and they control it all. I don't know. I'll have to look into that as in the next day or so. But let's move on to Avdivka. Just to remind you where Avdivka is, we have the Donetsk front down here, coming down from Luhansk into Donetsk. Bakhmut is sort of halfway down that front. And as we move down past Horlivka, the city there, towards the larger city of Donetsk in the Donetsk Oblast, we have Avdivka, which is being sort of surrounded here. And it is a case of repelling lots of attacks around here. Pervomaisky, as ever, Vodjanye. One military blogger has suggested that the Ukrainians are putting together a counterattack toward Opitne, which would be interesting. It can't be verified at the moment, but that is an area that they have lost some ground over the last week or so, as the Russians are pushing in their encirclement towards Avdivka. Also worth noting, around here, just south of Pervomaisky, is Nevelsky, and this is a tiny settlement, really, that is the target for the Russians. There's a lot of fierce fighting around here. They took some ground. These are all heavily fortified tree lines with trenches built in. I told you last week that the swimming pool, as it is known, a former reservoir, was taken by the Russians, but there are other sort of placements around here and heavily fortified areas. There is the Russians are continually trying to attack Nevelsky. They have been repelled so far. I'm not exactly sure how far the Russians have advanced in this area, but that is one of the key areas in this whole front here, because if they can unlock Nevelsky, then they can start flanking Pervomaisky, possibly a bit more than a northern, bit easier than a northern flank, given that they can't seem to get past Vodjany, and there's a lot of open ground here that the Ukrainians have. Obviously fortifications, but they can shell really heavily here. So I just think that the Russians are preferring this southern approach to try and flank the Ukrainians in Pervomaisky. But other than that, it's just fierce fighting, shelling, of course. Donetsk gets heavily shelled by the Ukrainians. And as we come down past, there's also fighting near Krasnohorivka. So that's all happening there. But Marinka is the big area of concern for the Ukrainians at the moment. So what does Defmon say? Same story as usual. Russians have attacked Pervomaisky, Marinka, Krasnohorivka, and Novomykhailivka. Russian forces are accumulating units for an attack in this area, and we see that they're using incendiary munitions above Marinka, or on Marinka, which is, never a nice thing. These are controversial. Some countries who have signed up to certain conventions say these are not legal. Others who haven't signed up say they can be used basically on military targets. The question is whether large civilian areas are military targets, but then Marinka is pretty much going to be you're not going to have a lot of civilians living in there. So these things are sort of debatable, but it's really difficult fighting. So the Russians are claiming that the center of Marinka is theirs. Ukrainians saying possibly not. It's certainly at least a grey area, and that is where there's some tough fighting. And then we get down to the Pavlivka area, which has seen, again, lots of fighting all around here. In fact, one of the things I've seen is that the Russians have repelled Ukrainian attacks all around here. So that's quite interesting. So here it is on the ISW. The Russian Ministry of Defense has claimed the Russian forces repelled Ukrainian counterattacks within 91 kilometers southwest of Donetsk city, near Novomykhailivka, Novodonetsk, Volodymyrivka, Pavlivka, and Vremivka in western Donetsk Oblast, and near Novodorivka and Levadny in eastern Zaporizhzhia Oblast. So the Ukrainians are potentially, as according to the Russians at least, active all around there, which is quite interesting. So that's all sort of down here, across to Vremivka, which I think is over here, and then onwards towards Zaporizhzhia. So yeah, interesting scenario there. I'm going to refer you just to a statement from a contract soldier. So again, not a mobilized soldier in the Russian 155th Naval Infantry Brigade. So he said that they sustained 900 casualties near Pavlivka. Now, we talked about this before, but this is interesting, particularly for one stat that he gives. So 450 to 500 KIA over the span of 3 months, and that the brigade was almost completely destroyed. Is receiving combat replacements. But here, everyone is demoralized. Yeah, it's just a really interesting letter. I'll probably go through this in the Ukraine War Update extra. And oh yeah, up here. I spent 3 months in this area. The fighting continued every day, and there were 2 intense days, 9th and 10th of November. Overall, about 450 to 500 men were killed. And then they appealed. So that's what I reported to you. He talks about how demoralized they were, how people wanted to desert. Near Pavlivka, we lost about 450 men. Overall, the toll is up to 900 men wounded and killed, more than half killed. That sentence is really, really interesting. People think about deserting, and I understand it. I'm contemplating the same idea. Now, why that's interesting is normally you operate to a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 injured to killed. Here, it's less than one injured person to one killed, which means that over half the casualties end in death. There must be something to do with very poor medical assistance here, that you've got really high KIA numbers. If that number is to be trusted, of course, there's not 100% certainty in that number, but I just think that that's absolutely fascinating statistic, and it reflects how difficult it has been for the Russians down in that area. So as we move on from Pavlivka area, let's look at Tim White saying the areas where Russia's been suffering most losses have been Donetsk and, until liberation of the right bank, Kherson. But now the occupied part of the Zaporizhzhia is one big graveyard. Russian bases in both Melitopol and Vesely struck by Ukraine, with 180 injured and likely 100 dead. So that is Melitopol and Vesely here. They are hitting quite often with HIMARS and other sort of rockets and artillery behind the lines in Zaporizhzhia. As I said yesterday, is that an attempt to soften up this area before an attack? Who knows? Okay, on the way to Kherson, what do we have to say about that? Okay, the first thing to say about Kherson is the shelling of the city itself that the Russians have been doing over the since liberation, really, but it's really picking up. I mean, lots of civilians are dying. This is just one example where 35 people were injured, including child. Actually, 15 people were killed in shelling yesterday. So Russia continues to target civilians in the territory it claims is Russian. This is a bizarre scenario I keep talking about, where they liberate somewhere like Kherson, they liberate it, say, yeah, this is ours. Then they pull out, withdraw from there, and then they bomb it, killing the very people they said that they have liberated. It's really difficult there. There have been calls to sort of get people out of Kherson so that they are safe, some kind of evacuation. But people who have just been liberated don't really want to leave there for obvious reasons. So it's a really difficult area at the moment. Over to the front, little things happened. No map changes, though. The Ukrainians have attacked sites at Chaplinka and Skadovsk again overnight. Ammo depots and Russian bases are hit. Russians shelled Kherson during the day, inflicting damage on residential buildings. They are, in fact, literally shelling them right now. The day has barely started, and Russia is already shelling Kherson. Powerful explosions are heard in the city, locals report. So it's pretty tough there. Over to Kimburn. So Kimburn, that I've talked about a couple of days ago, special forces have almost definitely landed there. My opinion at Kimburn is that it's mostly artillery battles, and there might possibly have been a special forces raid at some point. I think OC South wording, Operational Command South wording, is intentionally vague. The Kevel group, who are quite good for their daily reports on the whole theatre. In the southern Ukrainian counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces continue to resecure more settlements and ground. So there's a little bit more information here, especially along the Kimburn Peninsula, where the Ukrainian naval special warfare units have been very effective. We shall refrain from further details due to OPSEC, operational security, and talking about how sabotage and partisan activity is going on behind the lines in Zaporizhzhia as well. So, yeah, not a lot to come out from Kherson, other than their continued artillery duels right up and down the Dnipro River. The Kimburn Spit, there appears to be stuff going on there, but operational security keeps that intentionally vague. And yesterday, there are reports that hits as far down as Armiansk in this area, and so Russians are pulling people and defenses and depots further back into Crimea. So yeah, that's where we're at. Anyway, I hope that was useful. A bit longer today because quite a few talking points really, and I think they are important talking points as well. So I don't skirt around from talking about them. Please like, subscribe, share, do all the usual support that you always do. Thank you so much for that support. Please check out my other channel that I'm moving at the moment, 50% of my extra videos are there. So that is ATP Geopolitics. So ATP Geo. So if you do youtube.com/@ ATP Geo, you'll find that channel. Please subscribe there as well as here. If you're a subscriber here for this stuff, you need to be a subscriber there because it will all eventually be there. And I will no longer produce geopolitical videos here. This will be my philosophy channel. So I'm trying to do both, but in two different places. Thank you for your support, and thanks to all the channel members. As well as the subscribers and members are really important for supporting the work I do. Anyway, toodle pips, and I'll speak to you in the extra video later.